forums. All right, excellent. Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar from Australian Peace and Security Forum, Human Security, Trust in Home, Health, Food and Future. If you joined us for the APSF launch, welcome back. It's great to see you again. And for those of you who are newer and have just found us, welcome, and it's great to have you. My name's Matilda Byrne and I'm moderating this evening's webinar, and I'm joining from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I work and live, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this and all land throughout Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, especially in the context of discussing working towards Australia's peace and security. Indigenous Australian knowledge, experiences and realities are extremely important. APSF seeks to broaden the discussion of what peace and security for Australia means, and to have a comprehensive conversation beyond just narrow conceptions of security to something that is much larger, more comprehensive, focused on peace. And so I think it's really fitting that our first themed webinar is centered on this concept of human security, something that pivots the focus of security away from that of the sovereign state, territory, national security, and instead onto people. Recently at the UN, the Pact for the Future was adopted. And so at that and through this pact, states from around the world have expressed that there is a moment of hope and opportunity and a path to a brighter future for all of humanity. And this is through making a series of commitments to ensure well-being for all. And really, it is a crucial time for Australia to be invested in looking at what these commitments are and what other commitments might be appropriate for Australia in terms of ensuring the well-being of all Australians. Today, we're going to hear from three different speakers speaking to sort of different aspects of human security. And then at the end, there'll be time for Q&A discussion. So I'll introduce each of them as we go along. And so our first speaker today for the webinar is Dr. Donna Weeks, Emeritus Professor at Musashino University in Tokyo, where she researches Japanese foreign policy and politics and political philosophy. Since first visiting Hiroshima almost 40 years ago, Donna continues to engage in realizing peace-first security initiatives. And today we'll discuss rebuilding trust, how to approach comprehensive security in our region. So over to you, Donna.
Thank you, Matilda, for that introduction. And I would also like to acknowledge that I am joining you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people here in Mianjin, Brisbane, and I pay my respects to those here. I actually thought I was going second, so anyway, I'll kick off our discussion. Look, this comes for me from a long period of doing research in Japanese foreign policy, politics, Australia-Japan relations, what our security could look like in the region. Why I'm focusing on this particular aspect at present is that I've been puzzled by the turn, if you like, in recent years of the Australia-Japan relationship from one that was quite broad-based and comprehensive, based on, as we are aware, largely trade in resources and so on. But this turn in the last 10 years or so, where we're becoming a much more closely aligned militarily. Defence cooperation is on the increase. And, you know, I think it's a turn that is not where we could have gone. So my discussion today, what I want to talk about today, largely focuses on not so much what is and what it's become, but indeed what is possible, what it could have been, and those sorts of those sorts of areas. I mean, what might a comprehensive human being focused security look like in the region? Arguably, we had a chance a decade or so ago. Why instead did we take this level of military cooperation? I'm often challenged to answer this question by those who would say that war is inevitable and every responsible state must prepare for it. I sometimes then flip that statement to ask, what are the conditions that make peace inevitable? Why don't we ask that question instead of spiraling into a security dilemma, as I think we are observing in the East Asian region at present? Imagine if we could talk about, for want of a better discussion, a better term, a peace dilemma. In other words, why not spiral into a peace dilemma in which countries aspired to building a peaceful and secure environment? Now, in writing the paper for today, which I plan to have put up on our website, it turns out it was much longer than 10 minutes. So I will modify the paper for later and put it up after our discussion today, and also taking on board your comments and questions to try and help fashion some notion of how our security might, the direction our security might head in future years. And so I'll really just tried to pull out some of the key points, I think, that offer us an opportunity to think about what an alternative, well, I don't like to say alternative, but what a peace-based, a human security-based approach might take. And I think Australia and Japan, given their relationship, which started not in the 1970s and 1980s as is commonly accepted, but we've had Japanese immigrants come to Australia in the late 1800s. We've had ongoing diplomatic relations for well over a century now. So I think we can take a lot of that on board as well. So I really just will take a few summary points out of the longer paper that will be presenting for the website, which is of itself a kind of a summary of the work I've been doing over the last 20 or 30 years on this particular topic. So it's a lot to put in 10 minutes. My organizing principle for this discussion is what we call in international relations a security community. A very quick definition framework for it, if you like, is where a group of states, nation states or countries can come together, work and cooperate together with the understanding that there'll be no conditions for war. Now, this has quite a long history as a organizing concept in international relations, but I use primarily the work of Adler and Barnett from 1998 to try and define what that might look like in the East Asian region. In other words, countries come together for a very broad sense of community without preparing for war, but looking at other ways that a region can strengthen. Now, in thinking about this for this particular presentation today, I guess a way to summarize it is that in recent, 20 or 30 years ago, we saw very much in the East Asian region, which is my area of research and interest, an inclusivity, if you like, of countries and security and dialogue. We had, for example, ASEAN. Now, when we talk about security community, ASEAN is a kind of example of that, and the way it's built up confidence, trust, and so on amongst partners over the years. We saw APEC develop in the late 1980s, around about the time I was doing my graduate studies in Tokyo, under the Hawke government. That was another way to bring countries together. It was largely trade-based. Certainly there was the element of US security, the umbrella of US security there, but it was, again, another way to bring in many countries in the region. Along the way, we had the G7 expand to the G20, again, a way to be more inclusive. Now, in recent times, and I guess this is part of why we in the APSF have come together to rethink the way security might be presented in the region, we've had the gear shift firstly to the Quad. Now, people may have heard of the Quad, may not be sure of it. The Quad has had a kind of a longish history. Essentially, it's 4 countries, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Now, this was a grouping that was brought together under the leadership of former Prime Minister Abe. And I think one of the things, and we don't have enough time to talk about it today, but Abe had a very strong, he had a very revisionist view of what Japan could be. And I think this underlies the change in the Australia-Japan relationship too. Abe, the idea of the Quad came out of a book that Abe wrote, in inverted commas, in 2006, where he was putting forward his ideas. Abe, when he came back to power in 2009, in 2012, I'm sorry, after losing the LDP lost power for 3 years there. In returning to power in 2012, he came back very hard line about Japan becoming the great imperial power that it once was. In order to do that, it had to become a military power. Now, that was for me a kind of a trigger to see that the Australian government, having gone with Japan, developed the relationship in a different way, was suddenly enabling, I like to say, enabling Abe to realise this. So the Quad, those 4 countries, it expanded the notion of the Asia-Pacific, which had been the broad organising principle in the region, to something of the Indo-Pacific. Now, the Quad set themselves up as, well, we are countries that are, the representative democracies of the region. Now, that immediately excluded South Korea, New Zealand. So we went from that broad inclusivity, and we're starting to get something of an exclusivity that has started, that meant there were ructions with other countries in the region. Those tensions started to build when we tried to augment this notion that, only these 4 countries should cooperate. Now, after that, continuing on this inclusivity to exclusivity theme that I've realised is coming about, there's another shift to AUKUS. Now, while Japan was pleased to be part of the Quad, suddenly it's excluded. Notwithstanding, I believe there was some something at Jervis Bay over the weekend that to do with AUKUS, and Japan might be invited to join again afterwards. So we've seen, and I've just seen I'm running out of time already. I'm halfway through what I wanted to say in the summary part. So we've gone from this idea of inclusivity to exclusivity, from broad-based regional partnerships and engagement to a very narrow focus. And it's very much on that military aspect. Now, to me, Australia and Japan should and could, and I'll talk about this more in the question section, but we could broaden that cooperation again to a much more a broader form of human security. We have the self-development goals, the SDGs, for example, that offer an opportunity for Australia and Japan to show a different idea of security leadership in the region. And we need to have that shift rather than continuing down this ongoing defence and military cooperation. We need to pull back and we need to rethink. And there are several ways in which I think that we can do that we can push more towards that human security aspect through the SDGs, through cooperation, through a whole range of other ways, particularly in the environment as a resource country and so on. But I shall leave that for discussion and the longer paper. So that's my 10 minutes. So thank you very much. Tilly, I'll hand it back.
Great. Sorry, my voice is gone. Thanks, Donna. And thank you for that great, I think, outline of the trajectory or some of the trajectories in the thinking about security in our region, and also highlighting or pointing to that possible direction of a human security focus and peace-based approach that maybe we can tease out more in the Q&A discussion. Now, though, I'll introduce Dr. Albert Palazzo, who is an adjunct professor at the UNSW Canberra. He has published widely on Australian military history and national security, and today is going to consider the future security of Australia in light of a weakening social contract. So Al, I'll hand over to you. I believe you have some slides to pull up as well. Perfect. We can't hear you. There we are.
Has the share actually worked?
Yes, you just need to go into presentation mode.
Which is not happening. I'm afraid I can't get it to go into presentation mode. Not entirely sure why. It just won't expand to the full size. And it won't allow me to scroll. So, all right. Well, let's just do away with the slides. And I'll just close that off. All right. And I'll just speak here. And as I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngarigo people on whose land I live and from where I am speaking. Now, I'm going to be talking about the social contract, the Australian social contract, and it's, which is, I believe, in the early signs of fraying. And people maintain a social contract because as social animals, it's simply a part of our nature that we can gain a real security benefit by working together collectively. And not only just for security, it also enables us to exploit resources collectively. And we've been doing that since the start. And what holds these societies together, that is the foundation of the social contract, is essentially trust, the ability to trust each other. And without that trust, collapse is a likely societal outcome. So we call this a social contract, and people come together, and this trust works in three different ways. It's the citizens trusting those of the government who they've allocated power. It's the government trusting the citizens to obey the laws and fulfill their obligations. But most importantly, it's citizens trusting each other. The modern social contract also has two other features in that, yes, people can excel. Those with particular skills can stand out from everyone else, but everybody is also equal in their own dignity and equal in their opportunity and treated by the government fairly and equitably. And it is essential for the government to treat people fairly and equitably. So there's a danger here that if people start to lose this trust, if they feel that the government is no longer treating everyone equally, then that is when a social contract can begin to fray and a society become destabilized. And I think that we're seeing the early stages of that, particularly between that there's a growing expectation gap between those who are young, like Generation Z, and people of my generation, the boomer generation. And resources and opportunities over our lives of the boomers has flowed to them at a much more prodigious rate than which Generation Z are experiencing now, and or the expectations they would have to experience in the future. And that is beginning to show up in a declining trust among the young. And the Scanlon Foundation in 2023 did a report onto social cohesion, and they found that only 36% of the members of Generation Z had trust in the federal government. And this was supported by a report prepared by the Department of Home Affairs, Strengthening Australian Democracy, which also found that the young people were less likely to trust the government. So, in what areas does this discrepancy between what the older generation has had available to them and to the younger generation? And this is all fairly basic things to which members of a liberal Western democracy would have expectations to have access to. And such things such as, housing. Not everybody of my generation owns a house, but it is a relatively high percentage. Whereas many young Australians, something like 86%, have experienced financial difficulties in the last 12 months or have faced underemployment. And the Grattan Institute reports that younger Australians are going to be the first generation to face lower living standards. And education. I wasn't in Australia at the time, but apparently my generation was able to enjoy free university education, whereas my children, developed HECS and now HELP debts that are actually all of my children's HELP debts exceeded the cost of the median cost of an average Sydney home in 1970, which was only less than $19,000. And the Sydney home now costs $1.4 million. Life expectancy is now in decline, peaking with the millennial generation, and the Generation Z are expected to have shorter life expectancies than their elders. And disposable wealth. The younger generation, due to many of them being stuck in the gig economy or casual employment, are unable to build careers that lead to higher salaries. And so the opportunities to feel comfortable in spending money, creates that absence creates anxiety, and that anxiety then translates into a lack of trust, not just in the government, but also between the generations. And perhaps that's even more critical. And also a stable and healthy climate. My generation has punted on its responsibilities to do something about climate change, whereas the younger generation, or those now coming of age, look at a future in which they will not have the benefit of a stable climate in which to build their lives and raise their children, those that decide to have children, because only 50% are planning on having children. And the government continues to favor policies that do not address climate change. So what this means overall, and we can see this in certain consequences. Now, there's lots of factors that involve these statistics, but social engagement has been declining since around 2010. And volunteers in Australia, there were 36 million volunteers in 2010. And in 2020, it is now down to 25%. Declining participation in society, in voting. We all, voting may be mandatory, but the percentage of informal voting continues to rise as people who've been, required to vote and decide that they will opt out of that action by simply handing in a blank ballot or marring their ballot in some other way. And the government seems particularly concerned about declining recruiting for the ADF. And you may be aware that the ADF is approximately 5,000 recruits under strength. And the ADF isn't very large to begin with, but this is a quite significant percentage. And they're trying to increase the recruitment rate and are failing. And I think one question that they need to ask is, why would a young person who's the prime recruiting age, Generation Z, be inclined to take on a very dangerous job when the government is not reciprocating by providing their generation with the equity which has been provided to older generations? So we can, speculate on where this is all going, but we do have an example from across the sea. When trust reaches perilously low levels, we have in the United States a society that is now driven by factions, in which trust is in very great decline, and where groups of people simply don't trust each other, where facts are now considered a nonsense, where science can no longer be trusted, and where the government is very much not trusted. And if this continues in the United States, there's only one outcome here, and that is societal collapse. Now, Australia is nowhere near that, right? But we're seeing what I would say warning signs. Society is throwing up a flashing yellow light that not everybody feels like they're included in the society and that they're being treated equitably. And as Generation Z matures, and if these things don't change, then Australia may come into serious problems. And it's all up to the government really to start to revising the policies that have favored my generation into ones that favor my generation less and provide more opportunities for the younger generation, as well as the members of the older generation advocating for a better deal for the young. And I'd like to stop there and turn it back to you, Matilda.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing attention to the eroding trust in the social contract, particularly of younger generations. That's really stemming from, I think, insecurities. So insecurity of the climate, economic insecurity, housing, and so forth, as you so greatly sort of gave an overview of just now, and what that might mean if there isn't some really work done to rebuild that trust and gain more equitable sort of policies moving forward. For now, though, I'm going to introduce our final speaker and welcome Daniel Hyslop, who is the Head of Research and Senior Peacebuilding Advisor at Interpeace, and who will be speaking to a moment of hope and opportunity.
Thanks so much, Matilda, and thank you, Donna and Albert, for your remarks. Very interesting and good to see people on the call. Very happy to support this this very great initiative, the Australia Peace and Security Forum. And I'll try and present some slides. I hope I have more luck than Albert. And I should also acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation. And it's it's a lovely evening, but I'll just see if I can bring this up. And I guess one of the briefs that I was given prior to this is to talk about a thing called the Pact for the Future, which is a process that the United Nations has been running for the past couple of years. That really has been the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres's big picture, I guess, initiative to revive and revitalize multilateralism. And I was in New York about a month ago, attending a lot of the events and on the sidelines of a lot of the negotiations for the pact, and I guess working in the policy area of Interpeace also provided a lot of input or attempted input into the pact, and I'll talk a little bit about what I think it means. But before I do, I just want to really try and situate the conversation amongst some broader international security trends. And there's really 5 big trends that I think warrant our attention. I mean, the first one, it's not surprising, and look, a lot of these are perhaps not surprising, but there's very strong empirical evidence that really does support them. So the first one is just the really very significant increase in the number of violent conflicts, and especially in internationalized conflicts, proxy conflicts. we're really seeing, if you just count up the number of conflicts since World War II, I mean, we're almost at an all-time high. And that really is quite different from the fall in the number of conflicts that we saw from World War II to the end of the Cold War era. I mean, we're really seeing a very significant uptick. I mean, the second major trend is the decline in governance. And I guess by this, we could say, the quality of democracies, the quality of, freedom of the media, the rise in popular movements, the rise in polarization. The sort of high-level statistic on this is, if you look at the VDEM data, which is an attempt to quantify the level of democracy across the world, it basically shows that 72% of the world's population, 6 billion people, actually now live in authoritarian regimes globally. So far more people are living in these authoritarian regimes than in democratic ones. And that's really shifted very significantly in the last 20 years. The third trend is just the fact that there's much more interconnected system change. I mean, climate change is the obvious one. COVID-19 is another obvious one. But whilst we're seeing this, I guess, threat to multilateralism and I think decline in multilateral cooperation, which I think Donna had sort of touched on in her remarks in our region, the irony, or the bitter irony, is that the need for multilateral cooperation is getting greater, not less. I think the pandemic treaty just showed this, whether it's the Black Sea Grain Initiative, whether it's on climate change. And there's a real question here as to, I think, what is Australia's role in these, in these multilateral processes? I think connected to the third trend is just, these rapid technological changes, and it's really around social media, the pace at which information flows globally now. And I think in many of the conflicts that, say, Interpeace, the organization I work for, works on, especially in Africa, this is a very significant feature of a lot of the conflict dynamics, is the speed at which information can flow. And I think the perceptions of, especially of young people, and I think the awareness of, I think the relative deprivation that different groups have is much greater than before. I think it's also the fact that, I think Gaza shows this, that, there's much more serious, I guess, communication of the consequences of conflict. And I think that does create all sorts of domestic tensions in a lot of different polities, which is perhaps different than before. And then finally, I think the final trend is just the declining effectiveness of the liberal peacemaking order. And this is, I think, one of the sort of takeaways from the Pact for the Future. When you look at UN peacekeeping, when you look at the comprehensive peace agreement sort of processes that I think many people have associated successful peacemaking with, when you think of state building in Afghanistan or Iraq, I mean, a lot of these, I think the traditional, largely Western created toolbox is not only declining in effectiveness, but declining in credibility. And there's really a need to, I think, revive what is that liberal peacemaking order and what it looks like. And then I think the final, sort of sixth trend I would probably sneak in here is just a quote from the Secretary General himself, which is about the development paradox. And this is another empirical, I guess, truism that even though people are on average living longer, healthier, and wealthier lives, these advances have not succeeded in increasing people's sense of security. And that's borne out in a lot of different survey data that despite a lot of progress in a lot of areas, when you ask people about their sense of security, human security, political, environmental, social, economic, it is decreasing in many countries, and not just Australia. I think one other thing I'd like to draw attention to on the trends front is this massive increase in internationalized interstate conflicts. And this is basically a trend chart from 1976 to 2021 by the Institute for Economics and Peace, which I used to work at. Shout out to them for creating this. But it basically shows the number of conflicts per year by type of conflict. And you can see the green line, internationalized conflicts, massively increasing. And what that is really about is external actors intervening far more often in the affairs of other countries. A massive increase in proxy conflicts. And when you look at the reasons for that, it's really the emergence of a lot of middle powers. And we're not talking about just Russia, China, India. They're not middle powers. We're really talking about your Turkeys, Brazil, the Saudis, Qataris, in the Emirates. These are these conflicts are actually now creating a much more significant increase in global insecurity. And I think the question there to ask is, what is, given that trend, what is the legitimate and credible role of an Australia, which is a notable middle power, right, in the G20? When you look at a lot of these other conflicts, they are essentially G20 economies, and Australia happens to be one of the bigger ones, and is generally not really present. And yet we've had a very significant, I think, history, especially in our region, of peace building and peacemaking, like in Cambodia, for instance. And I think the second thing to take away is that it's really not obvious that a lot of these militarized approaches to deterrence, like you mentioned, Donna, about creating the Quad or AUKUS, these sort of new security cooperation arrangements, are actually going to be effective in improving deterrence. I mean, if anything, it's actually causing more conflict, and I think that's starting to be borne out in some of the data and statistics. I'm not going to go into some of these other trends because I don't have the time. And because I've realized to talk for 9 minutes, and I've got to talk about the Pact for the Future and talk about hope and opportunity, which I haven't done. So pardon me on that. Maybe we can get to that into the Q&A. But basically, what the Pact for the Future was really the SG's attempt to revitalize multilateralism. Did it really do it? Not really. You could argue sort of. It was a process that brought together a lot of countries. They did eventually agree on a document. There was an attempt by the Russians to basically undermine the entire process by inserting a clause that said none of this matters, which was rejected. So, I mean, you could say that because it came through, I guess it was to some degree, given the incredibly blocked circumstances in the Security Council, a success. But did it define a new multilateralism? It definitely did not. And I think the big tension at the heart of it was not really about east-west. It was really about north-south, and a demand from a lot of the developing countries of the world to see more inclusive multilateral institutions, and to see more inclusive UN institutions, and especially international financial institutions. And structurally, not much has changed, although I would say that there were some important reforms, which I can touch on. There were really 5 areas to the Pact, and I've listed them here: sustainable development, financing for development, international peace and security, science, technology, innovation, youth, and transforming global governance. And basically, my takeaway, not into pieces, my personal takeaway is that on sustainable development and international peace and security, it was a big fail, basically. On science and technology and innovation, I really can't comment on that because it's quite technical. I think there are some interesting conclusions around AI and conflict. I think the big interesting success, and maybe this links to what you were saying, Albert, was the elevation of the question of youth and future generations at a very high level. And I think it was interesting hearing your statistics about this, the decline of trust of young people in the social contract. I mean, this is also seen in multilateral and international institutions, and I think the UN really recognized that this is a big problem to the legitimacy of the UN and of international institutions if they can't get young people more integrated and more included in a lot of the structures. The big positive that came from the Pact for the Future was really on IFI, International Financial Institution Reform, where there were some very concrete proposals around how the rich countries of the world can basically better share their resources with some of the poorest countries of the world, and especially with things around the SDRs, for instance. There's also been a big wave of reform around trying to encourage a lot of the development banks to invest a lot more inclusively in a more bottom-up participatory way that's more conflict sensitive, more peace positive in a lot of the world's fragile and conflict affected places. This is a lot of what I've been working on. We've been trying to develop a new paradigm called peace finance, which is all about trying to unlock investment for some of the lowest income, poorest places in the world. A lot of really positive developments on that front, how you can better engage the private sector. But that's going to be really needed because, the main sustainable development agenda really was, I would say, a bit of a failure. The fact is a lot of the countries, that committed more than 0.7% of GNI to development aid are really backtracking. That's really stalled. There really hasn't been much on that. And when you talk about actual hard development, in many ways, we're going backwards. So it's going to become really important to leverage new forms of finance and investment to address poverty, food insecurity, peace in far more inclusive ways. So, but I think there is a real bright spot on that. Sorry, I've realized I've gone over. So I'll stop and looking forward to the comments. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you, Daniel. And what really struck me, I think, is just the point you raised on how people's sense of security, despite there being a lot of progress in political, environmental, social, and economic areas, hasn't actually increased along with it. And then obviously there's a lot of other, challenges and development that needs to happen also. What we'll do now is pass on to Q&A. We have about 15 minutes to do that. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I know you all probably have more to say, but I'll see first if there's quick questions straight from the audience. I can see there are a few different comments already in the chat. One question for the panel here that I can see is whether you think the non-aligned movement has any possibility of being reinvigorated as a way of focusing on the needs of ordinary people. And do you think we should be campaigning for Australian government to take part in that movement? So maybe I'll start there if any of the speakers want to speak to that.
I'm happy to. But yeah, please, Donna, Albert, come in. I think it's there's a very strong G77 non-aligned movement in the UN, and they make their voice, very much heard on a number of issues. I'm not sure if it needs to be reinvigorated per se. I think it is. There's already a very I think strong discourse about the needs of lower income, middle income countries, and then becoming more included in international institutions. But it is, it's very slow, and I think the degree to which Australia can take a part of that, there's obviously enormous diplomatic awkwardness about that. I think, it was interesting looking at Penny Wong's speech at the UN recently, where we've announced, a lot of support for peacebuilding, a lot of support with, an increase in development aid for a lot of Pacific countries, right, who are in this non-aligned grouping. We are supporting through the G7 plus, a lot of the countries on their, peacebuilding challenges. But one could argue that a lot of that support is relatively piecemeal, and it could be greater. And I certainly think it could be, but I don't know. I don't know if Albert or Donna would like to comment on that.
Yeah, but when you talk about non-alignment, Australia can talk into these communities, but ultimately Australia is one of the most aligned countries on the planet in our desire to enmesh ourselves with United States policy. So any attempts by Australia to appear to be non-aligned is farcical. And that would really require, major changes in government policy for that to have any credibility. So yeah, I don't think Australia has much of a standing in the non-aligned community.
Yeah, and similarly, I guess I'll just add a quick comment to that. I agree with both Daniel and Al, but significantly, in ASEAN, within our region, if I bring it back to our region, which I'm familiar with, ASEAN has that non-alignment aspect to it. Australia and Japan are both now so enmeshed in, as Al says, so enmeshed in that American foreign policy. And I think, looking at the result for next week, we've got to be really careful about where we want to be going as far as keeping that alignment. And I think what we're lacking, and I didn't quite get to it, but I have it here in my notes, ultimately what we're lacking is courage in our political leaders to say, actually, this is a greater area of interest. If Japan and Australia, for example, were to begin that sort of different alignment within the region and just sort of acknowledge that, maybe the United States is on the decline and we've really got to take us out of that milieu, and we haven't got a lot of time left to do that. But it will take courage, and I don't see it, unfortunately, in the foreseeable future, though I will keep, aiming for it from my little bunker, I guess.
While we're on the topic of those different kind of alignments, there is a question from John Smith on how BRICS fits into this. And no one in MSM seems to be discussing it, but it has the potential to change the world order. So I don't know if anyone has an immediate reaction to that as well.
Well, I guess there has just been a BRICS gathering of sorts. And again, this sort of speaks to some of the things I have concerns about, to what extent, these various groupings will gradually become more exclusive than rather more inclusive. India, if I recall, is part of that BRICS. India, which is part of the Quad, which we're supposed to be so boastfully part of, has a very eclectic sort of outlook. So, I think, again, I'd rather look more broadly at a more inclusive approach to things than this, but understand why BRICS became one such organisation.
Okay, so I've got a comment here from Janet Salisbury, who says there needs to be an international program of positive peace building, similar to the international approach to climate action, biodiversity conservation, and gender equality. Although, having said that, those UN programs move at glacially slow rates. So I wonder if any of the speakers want to talk about what an international program of positive peace building, what they see would be important to have in that, or if that might pull out some of the possible directions forward that you were thinking about in the areas that you spoke to.
No, Janet. It's an interesting, question. I think. Yes, I think many in peacebuilding would love such a concept. I think the reality is that a lot of the international institutions that administer, and I think if I think about peacebuilding, professionalized peacebuilding, which is the sector that I work in, how it's funded. I mean, it's mostly European governments funding it. It's very bureaucratic. It's whilst we try to create local ownership, it's really difficult because you're funded in a way that almost prevents that, and there's lots of rules around that. And so I've become increasingly skeptical that you can socially engineer peacebuilding processes through the old ways and structures that we've been basically working through. And I think there are, nonetheless, in spite of that, I think there are ways in which peace building can be better mainstreamed into several areas of international action. And I think climate change is a very interesting one. I'm going to be at a COP in a couple of weeks, which is in Baku this year. And this last year, the UAE, for the first time at COP, announced a peace, climate recovery and relief day, which was about trying to basically acknowledge that climate finance and climate action has to be conflict sensitive and peace positive if it's going to be effective. And when you look at the amount of money that's now flowing into climate finance, this is a massive opportunity to leverage those resources, not just for climate adaptation and mitigation, but for a peace positive approach. And it's really important acknowledgement that climate change is about people, politics, communities. It's not an engineering challenge, right? I mean, yes, it is. There are engineering challenges, but it's actually about people. So I think that's one avenue through which peace builders can and likewise for gender, right? And how the gender agenda has been mainstreamed in a lot of other areas of action. I think that's really promising. The only other quick thing I'd say is, I think that even though this is somewhat at odds with a little bit of the sociology of our sector, and I note the very good comments on neoliberalism, I think we do actually need to think about how we engage the private sector for peace, and how we can leverage the resources and the fact that the private sector can affect people's livelihoods and change people's lives in really positive ways if it's done in a peace positive way. And I think that's a big missing part of international assistance and international development still, even though there's a lot of work on that. But please, Albert, Donna, come in.
Being a military historian, I think a lot about war, and far less than perhaps I should of peace. But the thing about war is that they just don't happen. There's always a conscious decision to go to war, and I'm not sure how a process, a positive peace process, prevents or inhibits people from making that decision, because they see something useful in starting a conflict. And until you're able to convince people that peace is perhaps a better way to achieve what you want, they're going to continue to choose war. And that's perhaps the curse of the military historian, that one is forced to think along these lines. So my apologies to everyone. Donna, anything?
Yes, I guess my work sort of comes from that position and asks questions as to why war is inevitable. I mean, I know on one sort of level, there's that human nature argument, the human condition, if you like, that's inevitable. But given the consequences that we'll suffer from not acting on things like climate change, on changes on the environment, of not, making that really necessary change to those sorts of approaches to things. I mean, I suppose 40 years ago as a young student, I had hoped that in 40 years' time, my generation might have changed things. Well, unfortunately, it seems my generation is the one that's driving us into the ground. So I don't know where that went wrong, but I guess all we can continue to do is to those of us who can and do what we can to try and begins by changing the language around things, but by changing the assumptions, or challenging the assumptions, by speaking to as many people as we can to try and just the students I've taught over these, particularly the last 8 or 9 years or so in Tokyo, where I've been based, You know, Japan, my work is based largely from the Japanese perspective, I suppose, because in spite of Japan's increasing militarization, it's very much at the government level. And this would bring us back to the question of trust. You know, that people in Japan don't trust their government at the moment, because I've worked with a lot of peace activist groups and so on who absolutely want to maintain Japan as a peaceful nation. And, you know, what can they do in the face of where, you know, their government wants to take them at the moment? It's, I don't have answers at the moment, but I can assure you I keep thinking about it every day. So, you know, I'm grateful to be a part of this particular forum in that we can continue to address those questions. So I'm grateful for the opportunity today to put some of those ideas forward. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think that was a great prompt that stimulated a lot of different lines for thought. On the question or the subject of, I guess, increasing conflicts that we're seeing, the UN system and how it can, you know, work towards supporting human security, there's a question here from Catherine Kelly, a question on the power of the UN in the face of Israel's designation of the UNRWA as a terrorist organization, and can the UN do anything in this conflict?
Should I come in on this one? I mean, yeah, I mean, so I mean, the UN is, you know, I won't say anything that people don't know, right? But the UN is a body that's driven by its member states, right? And yeah, so when you ask the question, what can the UN do? Very often, the UN can only do what the member states want it to do, and the reality is, as we all know, the member states, you know, this is the you know, one of the major divides globally as to what to do in this particular conflict. I mean, I think what's interesting is that, you know, when you think about the Israel-Palestine conflict, I mean, a lot of the precedents and international law frameworks for resolving the conflict come from, you know, widely you know, I guess referred to General Assembly resolutions that have international consensus. And, you know, I think, you know, that still is very much the benchmark, right, for, you know, what are possible next steps to a solution to the conflict. I think, you know, the UN, you know, is very stuck in terms of actually being able to be a leader in any mediation process. I don't think it will be. I mean, I think this is one of the interesting trends that's emerging, is that you have these non-traditional actors now playing a role in trying to mediate the conflict, right? I mean, as the Chinese have tried to do, right? As you know, there's been many different actors getting, you know, involved in trying to mediate the conflict. I think what's, you know, and maybe this is just one tidbit. I mean, I have been, you know, through my professional work, talking to a lot of the different donors, countries that are looking at the post-conflict challenges in Gaza. And I think it really is important to recognize just how significant those post-conflict reconstruction needs are. I mean, you're talking about, you know, 80% destruction, and it's going to take at least, they think, at least 15 years to remove the rubble, right? And, you know, by the way, there's asbestos everywhere. So, you know, you've got incredibly complicated just recovery efforts, let alone reconstruction. And I think what's critical now in terms of looking forward is for the international community to start to think about how a independent Palestinian state could be properly financed, right? Its recovery financed, and it's, you know, for it to have some kind of economic structure, because at the moment there is no prospect of that. And yet there are actually really significant opportunities that could help a Gaza be reconstructed. What's interesting about all of that is that none of that really benefits Israel in the long term. because you are going to actually have okay, we can go into the details of that, but the level of destruction and the level of dependence is really not in the long-term security interests of Israel. And so there actually are, I think, a lot of potential openings for a mediated settlement and for international support. But as long as it remains a kind of elite-driven process with a small clique of elite actors running it, it is, I think, it's a very pessimistic future. But those are some quick takes on that question. Albert or Laura, over to you.
Yeah, if I could just perhaps take a slightly different approach to that. In 1999, the intervention in East Timor went ahead because the United States leaned on Indonesia to allow it to go ahead. And this is what is needed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The great powers, particularly the United States, have to lean in and tell Israel that it's time to stop. And until the great powers, do that, Israel is getting a signal that they can continue to, blow the place up. And we have to, the great powers need to force the Israelis and Hamas and Hezbollah to the table. And then once that occurs, then we can actually start about not just about peace, but also reconstruction. But so far, the great powers don't seem to be interested in making that call. Maybe they will after the election, but certainly not in the lead up to it.
Okay, thank you. To all of our speakers, actually, because unfortunately we're going to need to wrap up. We're just over time. Also, I wanted to say thank you very much to everyone for your engagement in the chat. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of the comments. There was some contributions from Jenny Goldie on environmental security and nature scarcity and things of this kind. There was also a bit of discussion happening in regards to AUKUS. So it was really great to see the engagement and dialogue happening in the chat. That's really what these webinars are about, trying to stimulate conversation about these issues, what we mean when we talk about a comprehensive security, trying to achieve peace and security, what this means for Australia. So thank you so much for your engagement with that. APSF will be having one more webinar before the end of the year. It will be on Tuesday, the 3rd of December. So earmark that date and look out for updates from us for more details. Thank you all once again for tuning in this evening and being part of the discussion. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matilda. Thank you, panelists.